Welcome, students, to week 7. I'm just still recovering, I think, like as all of us are, from the intensive. But we need to keep moving forward, and the focus this week is important. We're looking at immigration and race, and we're looking at intersectional impact and action. Some of the material that I'm going to go over right now in the video is material that we went over last week, but I want to go back and review it, and then I also want to go a little deeper into some aspects of it. So we talked about the shameful history, but we're going to recap it right now. That before 1965, Asians were specifically excluded from migrating to the United States, and migration quotas per country were based on where people came from in the late 1800s. So the percentage of people that were allowed from each country were the percentage of people that were here from that country in the late 1800s. Now, of course, that ignores the fact that the continent of the Americas was not part of the immigration system. And of course, there were large numbers of African Americans here who were not considered white, but were considered citizens. So it's an imperfect race-based exclusion from citizenship, but it certainly is race-based exclusion. And up until 1965, when I was 9 years old, so pretty recently. We also see not only explicit race-based exclusion, but we often see anti-immigrant propaganda. So immigrants, as recently as Donald Trump's administration, were spoken of publicly by people in authority, people in high positions of leadership, as rapists and criminals. And then we've also seen not only race-based exclusion explicitly before 1965, and not only propaganda that was anti-immigrant, but we've also seen selective enforcement. So we've seen an emphasis on the southern border rather than the people who came from a variety of countries and overstayed visas. And we've seen that the focus of raids is only on people that are brown or black or Asian, not on people that are white. So you don't have raids in Boston in bars where a number of Irish bartenders work who are undocumented. So there's various ways in which we see race being influencing the immigration system and process. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why propaganda matters. That I think many of us grow up with a little saying that sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. You know, my mother taught me that little saying as a way of trying to help me not worry about what people thought of me or not be unduly impacted or influenced by what people thought of me. And that's very nice if you can do it. But the truth is that what people think of you, particularly if it's repeated, and particularly if you experience it as surround sound, as something that the society as a whole is saying, has enormous power. So the Rosenthal experiment was done in the 1950s. And what they did in the 1950s is they used school classrooms for the experiment. They told the teacher of one classroom that her students were slow students, that they had difficulty learning. They told the teacher of another classroom that her students were wonderful, brilliant students. And they told a third teacher that her students were normal, that there was a variety. In fact, all of the students were normal. All of the students represented a variety of different levels of intelligence and capacity. But when it came to performance, to an absolutely shocking extent, the students that were seen as slow students did not perform well in school. The students that were seen as brilliant students performed brilliantly. That's wild, isn't it? And then the students that were seen as average, as a variety of students, performed at a variety of different levels. So it was enormously powerful. They called it the Pygmalion effect, after My Fair Lady, which was a story about a woman from a very poor part of London who was groomed by a sociologist to pretend to be be able to speak as if she was from an upper class and to be able to imitate the customs and the behaviors of people from upper class, and essentially became upper class. So that was not about race, it was about class, but it's very similar. Same essential impact of framing. The Clark doll experiment, which was in the 1930s, gave African American children white dolls and black dolls, and they consistently preferred the white dolls. So both of those experiments really highlight that framing matters, that how we talk about people, how we refer to people, particularly, again, if people are referred to repeatedly, and particularly if it's surround sound. If generally in the society they're referred to in a certain way, or leaders who have real power and authority refer to them in that way. George Lakoff is a linguist. He wrote a little book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And of course, what do you think of when someone says don't think of an elephant? You immediately think of an elephant. And his point is that even if, as you're using certain language, you say that you don't agree with it, the language still has power. So if you say, I believe that there are reasons why we need to carry a tax burden, what will stay in your mind is tax burden. And that image of taxes as burdens will still affect you, even if someone is saying, I think that we need to shoulder the tax burden for this reason and this reason and this reason. So even if people are using derogatory terms, but saying that they don't use them, using them to talk about how they don't believe in them, they still have an impact. So as we look at the integration between race and immigration, we really need to look very clearly at how immigrants are portrayed, how immigrants are spoken of, and to take seriously the impact of that. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about intersectional action. The Millennial and Generation Z generations have really called for intersectional action, that people who have different concerns and experience different kinds of injustice would work together to create a more just society and to create a society where everybody's concerns and needs were cared for. That is easier to talk about than it is to do, but there are some clear examples of how that's being done around issues of race and migration. So there are immigrant organizations who are now including racial concerns. One example of that would be to advocate for immigrants who have committed crimes. Instead of separating immigrants into the good immigrants who have never committed a crime and the bad immigrants who have committed crimes, that those organizations recognize that whether or not somebody is charged with a crime can be racially shaped and influenced. And so we need to look for, and just I want to give you a very simple example of that. When I was a young woman, that white powder cocaine had much lower penalties than crack cocaine. And crack cocaine was much more common in African American and Hispanic communities, and white powder cocaine was much more common in white wealthy communities. And there were real different penalties for both of those, even though it was the same drug and had the same impact. So recognizing that who gets charged with a crime, who gets convicted of a crime, how much time someone does, how serious their punishment is often racially shaped. And therefore, we should not separate immigrants simply into those who have not committed crimes, who we want to be in this country, and those who've committed crimes who we don't want to be in this country. And of course, as Christians, we add another layer to that, right? Which is that we really do believe in repentance and forgiveness and second chances. In fact, we think we've all had one because through Jesus' death for us on the cross. So that's another layer to this issue, but the organizations that are taking this intersectional approach are taking it for the reasons specifically that I just spoke about. There are racial justice organizations who are increasingly adding immigration concerns. So BAJI is Black Alliance for Just Immigration. That's an alliance of African immigrants, but they're increasingly being joined and supported by African American citizens of the United States. So that's fairly recent, over just, I think, the last decade that's been happening, in any significant numbers. And then Black Lives Matter has also included in various places in the country immigration as an issue that they're concerned about. So those are very concrete examples of intersectional actions that are strategic and targeted and effective. It's also true that there are organizations that care about immigration that have begun to look seriously at their internal processes and to do racial justice evaluations of their internal processes and to make changes. So I've mentioned several times the African American Hispanic Pastors Network that we built in South Los Angeles. And one of the things that we discovered in that network that I just want to lift up as the last little piece of information that I want to give you is that we really discovered that this was not a problem that you solved, the difficulties and the tensions between African American and immigrant communities, that wasn't a problem that you solved and then you just went forward. It was a problem that you had to continually confront. Just like Martin Luther said that the church has to be continually reforming, there isn't such a thing as a reformation. In the same way that dealing with racial justice issues, even in immigration organizations or organizations of primarily immigrants, is something that you really have to do on an ongoing basis. That this is, we would say in Spanish, concientización, which is a becoming conscious. That this is a constant becoming conscious. And that's true on a multitude of levels, including the awareness of cultural differences and the willingness to build bridges across cultural differences. So thank you. I look forward, as always, to your dialogue this week. Blessings.